Welcome to our third week. Is this the third week back of the Material Text Workshop? I'm John Pollock. It's nice to see some newish faces. I'm one of the co-conveners of the workshop, along with Zach Lesser from the Penn English Department and Jerry Singerman sitting next to him, who is Emeritus Humanities Editor at the UPenn Press. There is a sign-in sheet going around for those of you here in person, if you'd like to be on and are not already on our mailing list. Our topics vary sometimes widely from week to week. We went into Japanese books on week one, deep bibliography with Randy McLeod last week. And tonight we're turning to 19th century processes with Julie Mellby. And that's just a taste of the many different things coming during the semester. Next week, we'll go back to the Renaissance with Heather Wolf. So we would like this seminar to be interdisciplinary. We like it to be chronologically nimble. Please invite your students at all levels. Please invite your friends and colleagues in different departments. That's really what we are trying to get this seminar to be, a chance for us to get out of our own little zones and think across all of these contexts. So that's the big goal, and we count on you to help encourage that. One other quick announcement. This is a full week here at Penn in the Kislak Center. Different topic than tonight's, but on Friday, for you early modern fans, we have a symposium and conference on Petrarch, organized by the library and our friends and colleagues in Italian. This is to celebrate a spectacular acquisition of a Petrarch manuscript. And that day will conclude with a concert up here in this space by our friends Pifro. So there will be a chance to see the manuscript around that concert, and there's a symposium which starts at what time, Lynn?
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock in the afternoon. So don't spend your Friday afternoon outside throwing a Frisbee. Come talk about Petrarch with us. Any other announcements? Okay. Again, for those in the room, there are some spectacular things to look at. Maybe with some fancy camera work afterwards, we can give the Zoomers a glimpse. But my big thanks to Jim Duffin, my colleague and assistant director and curator at the University of Pennsylvania Archives, who's brought Edward Muybridge negatives. We have a positive from this collection here and some books with heliotype images. We're going to learn all about these things, but there are lots of goodies to look at tonight. Because tonight's speaker, I'm happy to welcome, is Julie Mellby. Julie's topic, as you've read, is one of these always mysterious 19th century processes, at least mysterious to me, the heliotype. And this talk has a place in an informal sub-series of talks we're doing this year on the topic of substrates. So let it not be said that we are superficial. We're always going deep. Some of you know Julie, I'm sure. She is the Graphic Arts Curator Emerita at Princeton University and has had a long and distinguished career. Before Princeton, she was at the Toledo Museum of Art, the Houghton Library at Harvard, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. And she holds degrees from Columbia and from Hunter College, where, according to your webpage, she specialized in 20th century modernism before tiptoeing backwards. Okay, so it says. I think, and you'll hear this tonight, that one of the things Julie is noted for is the remarkable range of her work. She is one of the great specialists on early photographic processes and printing. She has recent papers, including one called Never Fade Away, the Permanent Photograph at the National Gallery, Edward Wilson and the Mechanical Photographers in Bristol at the Royal Photographic Society, and Printing Big, Audubon, Havel, and the Double Elephant at the Center for Printing History in Pescara, Italy. So she can go small and she can go really big. She also has numerous books and publications, catalogs, including one on the author's portrait, and a recent collection, recent Princeton collection, I suspect, the Molly and Walter Barres collection of modern illustrated books. That was in the early 2000s. But tonight, I think you'll find will be really special. Slight digression, but hopefully this will work. There is a lawn sign near my house that reads, "Don't be weird." Weird is having a weirdly political moment. Tonight, Julie's topic is strangely timely because we could say her topic, her subject, is weird. That is, she will be putting back the weird in Edward Muybridge, the eccentric or difficult or challenging, to say the least, or perhaps wild and dangerous genius who pioneered a kind of stop motion photography. Edward or Weird Muybridge seems to have had about 12 names or aliases throughout his life, and people still argue about how that was really pronounced after all. Maybe Julie has the answer. But Muybridge did resolve that great quandary of his age. Did a horse in full gallop have all 4 feet off the ground at any point? And the plate is on the table here to prove that the answer is yes. And because this is a really important Penn subject, Muybridge was behind one of Penn's grandest scientific projects, Animal Locomotion, a spectacularly enormous thing which took place between 1883 and 1886, with a football field of cameras up the street where the veterinary school is now. So I'm sure we'll hear more about this odd, dare I say, weird fellow and his cameras, his thousands of photographic images and studies of horses and hippos and lots of naked men in all kinds of poses. So I think we have here the weird origins of moving motion pictures and cinema, and Penn was, in its weird way, at the forefront of it. I'll stop now. That's enough from me, and turn the microphone over to Julie. Thanks so much for being here.
Great introduction, and I thought you were going to bring up the bookworm from last week.
Could have done, yes, right.
There you go. Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who made this so easy. I'm just in awe of this series that has continued for so many years, and with such a dedicated audience as well. The focus of this talk is the printing innovation of a man named Ernest Edwards, not somebody most of you have probably heard too much about, but he is the one who developed this process that he called the heliotype, or gelatin print. As I said in the introduction, in the 19th century, photography makes its debut, is copyrighted, and everyone loves it. But what everybody finds out right away is that either it fades and turns to white, or they haven't developed it and fixed it and it turns to black. And so the real drama of the 19th century within this world of people is, how do you fix the print? How do you make a photograph that will be with you forever and have some longevity? A lot of people were working on this. I don't want to say that Edwards got the only process that ever worked, but he is the one who really made it work commercially and made it work, I think, in the most beautiful, long-lasting, full-tone image printed directly onto the sheet of paper, so it doesn't have to be cut and pasted, and without this silly halftone screen that breaks everything up and you can practically see it with your eyes and makes for a very rough image. Now, I just wanted to show that he did give away the process almost immediately. This was not something that was a secret. And because of this, a lot of people out there in the world began using them, especially journalists, publishers, within the inner world, heliotype became this amazing process that found its way a lot of places right away. And I'm going to talk about the minutia of it in a minute, but I just wanted to point out the generic vocabulary that we use today. A heliotype is one version of what people say is a colotype, which is one version of the greater photomechanical printing, the idea being that you take something that comes out of a camera or a computer these days, but you take the photographically captured negative and somehow you translate this into ink so that it lasts. The two publications that I think did this using Edwards' particular heliotype in their best light were first Charles Darwin's seminal 1872 Expressions of the Emotions in Man and Animals, followed somewhat later by Edward Muybridge's spectacular monumental series that he called Animal Locomotion, begun here at the university. I am guessing that most people in the room are familiar with Muybridge because it is here that he developed, as you said, this amazing project. And I just wanted to show just a tiny little bit of the tremendous finding aid that's online. It's one of the best finding aids I've ever used, and I'll stick to that. And I'm just highlighting the portion that I used the most when I came to use the material here, although it goes on for pages and pages. And if anybody wants to know how to write a finding aid, I would start with this. But Ernest Edwards is somebody I'm guessing most people don't know. So let me just start out by saying he's born in London. He has a career in London. He goes to Boston, has a second whole career in Boston, and then goes to New York and has a third entirely different new career there. He is best known for his printing and publishing businesses that he established beginning in London with the Autotype Printing and Publishing Company, followed by the Heliotype Company, also in London, the Heliotype Printing Company that he established in Boston, the Photogravure Company when he moves to New York City, and finally the Photogravure and Color Company, begun in New York, moved to New Jersey, and really was functioning well into the 1960s. Many of the most beautiful photography books of the 20th century by Paul Strand and Stieglitz and other people were printed by the Photogravure and Color Company. But his first career was as a portrait photographer. He had a business not far from the fictitious Sherlock Holmes apartment on Baker Street. It was the center of portrait photography at that time in London. And he photographed over 200 of the most famous scientists, academics, politicians, you name it. If they had any sort of celebrity behind them, they made their way to Baker Street to be photographed by Edwards. And they were published in a monthly series, 6 or 7 a month, which was called Portraits of Men of Eminence in Literature, Science, and Art. And I will just mention that Darwin was, of course, included, but so were women. Even though they didn't make it into the title, there were women coming to the shop as well. And Edwards, along with everyone else on the street, was concerned with the longevity of his images. They were not lasting. He would print them in this monthly series and then they would bind them. And at a very quick level, they would start turning either black or white. Many people were working on this, as I said, but for Edwards, he was most interested in a man named Joseph Swan, and Swan's chemistry and his process. Swan, you might know as the man who came up with the carbon filament light bulb. But during this work on the light bulb, he also came up with something that we call the carbon print or autotype. Edwards loved this. What Swan was doing was very much a sort of sideline, even though he does get a patent for it. But Edwards comes in, has 5 or 6 of his own patents, figures out a way to make carbon prints, which are rather complicated. He figures out a way to produce them in editions large enough to make them commercially viable. And here is where I get into minutia. So everybody hang on to the table. Let me try and just give you a generic overview of a carbon print to start with. Think of Jell-O. You've got gelatin, liquid gelatin, which is made from cutting up horses and cows. This is what you get when the horse goes off to the shop and he comes out in gelatin. They pour the gelatin onto a flat surface, usually glass, at least in the 19th century. They mix it with potassium bichromate and fill it with some kind of pigment. For most carbon prints, this is carbon black, so that you get this deep, rich black carbon. And once this solution has dried and firmed up, you copy print a photographic negative on top of the gelatin. And so wherever the light goes through the negative, the gelatin hardens. And wherever it's shielded, the gelatin stays soft and can be washed away in hot water. Here's just one other version of a description of how these things are made. It's a question of first the light hardening and then a number of washing baths at different temperatures to get rid of the gelatin that hasn't hardened. The material is placed onto usually a white paper support or substrate so that where the gelatin is very thin, the white comes through, and where the gelatin is very thick and hard, this is very black, and that's your image. And I'll just state the obvious. There isn't anything else. There's no ink, there's no further chemistry. It is the gelatin that is the image. And this is one of the reasons that it's so solid and permanent. It's this hard substance. It's not chemistry. And it took off immediately. People loved it, especially the high art end of the world. And so people like Thomas Annan immediately are using the carbon process. He was even on the board of their company for a time, and he takes it back up to Glasgow and makes these wonderful old closes. If anyone knows the Annan prints, William Stillman uses this for his beautiful Athens photographs. Even Alfred Stieglitz, a few years later, falls in love with the carbon print. There just is nothing better in terms of a detailed, full tone representation of what the camera negative is offering. I need to jump ahead a little bit. I'll leave that up in the story because I want to keep moving. I'll just say that the company had a lot of donors, a lot of sponsors. It took a lot of money. And one of the money men, who was connected to the Winsor Newton Art Supply Company, decided he didn't care for the way Edwards ran the business. Edwards was an artist. He was a printer. He was not a businessman, and he was forced out of his own company with the caveat that he could keep printing. He just couldn't print anything that would be something sold by his company. So basically, he could not make carbon prints anymore. Fine with him. He was not really interested in lawsuits, which came all the time. And so he went back to the drawing board, so to speak. He takes this hardened gelatin and figures out a way to use it as a printing matrix. That is, he uses a relief hard gelatin, which can be inked and printed into a permanent ink print. This is a relief process as Edwards practices it. I know if you look it up in the books, they say holotypes are lithography. There is a water element to this, but as Edward practiced it, this was a relief process which he printed on a standing vertical, what we call a common press in Albion or Washington, the same thing that we print books on, a letterpress. And it is a complicated process. It's a contact print on the light sensitive gelatin. It comes through, it hardens it where the light hits it. There are a number of baths, both warm baths and cold baths. One of the things that the cold water does is that it cracks the gelatin slightly and you get this reticulation or cracks. But one of the great things about Edward's process, and everybody has their own formula, their own recipes, but one of Edward's secrets was that he used alum. And if anybody is a cook, you know that if you put alum in, you get really, really crisp cookies. It makes things hard. And so he made his gelatin much harder. And in this way, he was able to store these gelatin matrices in the same way that we would store a wood block or a lithographic stone, which is tremendously important, especially for Muybridge, because the process went on for many, many years, and he had to keep printing it. Also, because of the hardness of the gelatin, you see that reticulation doesn't have to be big. It can also be very refined. And because of that, he got these beautiful, really beautiful black and white images. No longer are you putting the pigment into the gelatin, but you're putting it into the ink, and you could use any color ink you wanted. But the main thing about heliotypes that I just wanted, not the main thing, the thing I wanted to just stress, because of what we're going to see on the table here, is that most 19th and early 20th century photography, you're talking about a negative from which you get positives, and you get a lot of positives. With the heliotype, you have a negative to a positive printing plate from which you get the ink laterally reversed positive. And I mocked up what that might look like with a Muybridge project. I'm leaving off here all the individual, the thousands and thousands of individual glass plates and negatives that were then put together for this combination negative, of which some are sitting right here on the table. Just amazingly, I'm so sorry, everybody on the Zoom call, you have to come to Philadelphia because you're not going to believe what you can see here. So there's the negative, there's the positive gelatin matrix, which is laterally reversed, and then the positive ink on paper heliotype. And this is the process that catches the eye of Charles Darwin and his publisher, John Murray. when they decide that for his third big project, he wants to use this instantaneous film that photography is able to do now, and he wants to show these emotions in his book. They use a photographer named Oscar Rydlander, who comes up with these pictures mainly of his own kids and himself, and that's another whole story. But he turns in the end, 19 negatives to be printed, and they throw up their hands. They're talking about a book in an edition of 7,000, which in itself is ridiculous, but Darwin is a huge celebrity at this point. They think they could sell 7,000. And Sean Murray says, there's no way we can afford to print 19 plates, image plates within this. And Darwin says, settle down. What we'll do is we'll just put lots of images onto a single plate, and they got it down to 7 plates. Great, right? Great for everyone except for Edwards, because we're talking about contact printed individual prints. And so for this project, Edwards has to print each negative and then make each individual interpositive exactly the size that they're going to be printed on the plate. And beyond that, some of the plates are folded, so they have to be exactly in the right place on the plate before they can make the composite negative, before they can make the composite positive printing plate, and then make the plate. And so this is not just twice the work, but like 19 times the work. And much more expensive. There are lots of fights about money. In the end, it's Edwards who has to forfeit money. But for him, this is the first big book project after he's copyrighted the Heliotype. And this is going to prove that he has a working company and it's a viable process that's going to make these absolutely gorgeous images, which he does. And once he gets the matrix, then he really can print the edition. Unlike, and I'll just say that when you read about collotypes, you're mainly reading about 20th century, 1950s collotypes, which is a whole different thing. And they say you can only make about 500 collotypes. Edwards is printing thousands of his gelatin plates. He really had it down. In November of 1872, the book comes out. It's a huge success, but actually, Edwards never sees the book. He has gotten on a boat. He's accepted an offer from a wonderful Boston publisher, James Osgood, who is the best art book publisher, at least on the East Coast at the time. And they have a wonderful time together for about 12 years, during which time Edwards runs the Heliotype printing company and Osgood runs the business end of it. And knowing that Edwards is not a businessman, it's just a perfect relationship, because he shields Edwards from all the things that he really doesn't want to deal with. And he actually, again, this is a whole story in itself that I don't want to get sidetracked on, but he actually sells the permission to print Dickens in order to keep Edwards' Heliotype company. He has that much confidence in what the man is doing in terms of image prints. At that time, Muybridge comes into the story. He's off in California. He's doing this foolish photography to, show her horse's hoofs. While he's doing this, he decides he's going to publish a book of all of this. And he starts printing, and he prints thousands and thousands of albumin silver prints, actual photographs. And then they sit down at the kitchen table and they cut thousands and thousands of photographs, and they trim them and they paste them, and they try and make a book out of it, and realize, they don't want to do this in the end. And you can see by the time they get going, they really are different shapes. They're already starting to fade, a number of them. And he realizes he has to figure out another way to do this. Leland Stanford at that time comes out with his own book. And of course, he goes to Boston, to Osgood, to print it, because that's where you go if you want a book like this, high-end publishing. It actually has very little in terms of Muybridge images. Muybridge doesn't like the fact that his name isn't on the title page. And there are 5 heliotypes. These are the things to sort of remember. If he hasn't been introduced to Edwards in the heliotype by that time, which undoubtedly he was, 5 of his images are just beautifully printed in this book. One of the setup, a couple of horse images, and he realizes that this is the guy. And at that time, he gets this invitation from Philadelphia. Akins and Pepper, they form a committee. They offer him $5,000 for what, in the end, people are saying it was about a $30,000 project. They give him indoor space, they give him outdoor space, and he immediately comes to Philadelphia. And I put up the image of Muybridge himself, just to make the point that he's no longer really interested in horses. That was Leland, who was obsessed with the horse. He's interested in photography and what this instantaneous image can do for us. And he comes out with this enormous project, printed in heliotype, not in original photographs. It is so large, I can't imagine that anyone imagined how big this project was going to be. 781 plates, usually bound in 11 volumes at a cost of $600 when it originally came out. I have not found the contract, but because of this project, Edwards agrees to do the printing and moves to New York, sets up his own business with an office on Union Square, which is at the time the center of business in Manhattan. And his print shop is set up in Brooklyn, just off the Gowanus Canal, which just opened, making it a relatively easy trip by boat. And this is how they get the material from Philadelphia to the shop in Boston to do the printing. And I'm showing you a version of what's on the table right in front of us. Please take at least a few minutes when I shut up to take a look at these things. Let me talk just briefly now about this very complicated process. Edwards prints and prints and prints. And then he gets to about October 1885, and he starts moving them around and trying to figure out how they should look in this book, because they aren't in any way sequential as they were taken, as the negatives came out of the camera. And some of the plates, this is very obvious. There is no real movement sequence. And others, like this one, are relatively close. And if your eye sort of skims around, you can sort of get the idea of motion. But to make these, he makes individual glass plates and tapes them together. And this is what's sent to Brooklyn. If you can imagine it just making it there, let alone doing this whole process. Not everything is in such good condition as it is here. And so I just wanted to show you just one of the glass plates taped together that's down in Washington. There are a number of these around, and I don't mean that they're not treating things well. It's just that these have been through a lot of work and a lot of movement and a lot of process. Also in Washington are these amazing cyanotypes, and these are dirt cheap to make. And so this is how Muybridge figured out the sequences. He printed up all of these in all different sizes. You see some are vertical, some are horizontal. He cuts them to whatever size he wants. He plays with them for months. And this is how he knows how to make those glass positives. So he doesn't have to make a lot of them. Then they get sent up to Edward's shop, and he makes these composite negatives. Again, like Darwin, they're trying to, I'm running long. They're trying to do many images on just one plate. And you have these amazing negatives here. If you look very closely or with a magnifying glass, you can see that they are continuous tone. It looks sort of here like maybe there's just a big hole where the horse is. If you look closely, there really is a lot of tone there. And these are what he then prints, the gelatin matrix and then the image positive. It's $600. It's a bunch of images of things moving around. There isn't a big audience for this. And so that date that we all use, whether it's 86 or 87, is actually the beginning date of the project. Thomas Akins gives them space over across the way at the Academy of Fine Arts, and they lay out as many plates as they can possibly fit. They say it's all 781, but I can't imagine. They had space for that when you look at how big they are. They lay them out, they invite anybody they can get to come in the door, and they say, choose one from column A, one from column B, and for $100, you can have up to 100 plates printed. Unique albums, great, again, for them, but for us, how do we know what's out there? And if you look on WorldCat, some people say there were as many as 30 of these 11-volume sets. I found 3 on WorldCat. Of course, there are more out there, but how many is a real question. And the majority of volumes that you find in museums, in academic collections, with personal collections are these single volumes. So we have no idea if number 612 has maybe only 3 out there in the world and is absolutely so valuable, you should be locking it, you know, in the refrigerator. And so that's one problem mainly for us. We really need a couple of PhD students to go through these and come up with what is out there in the world. The other problem for Edwards is that Muybridge never pays. And a lot of people are not paying at this time. There is a depression going on in the early 1890s. But it's not just the money. Edwards has been holding on to these because he keeps getting these one-offs. Please print me these 100 plates. And so he has to pull out the matrices and print them. He has to keep everything going for this whole time. And he would like to get rid of them, frankly. Thank you so much for pulling all of this. We have some of the letters, we have some of the lawsuit here. He finally gets a lawyer and he says to Muybridge, either you pay or I'm going to destroy everything. And this is enough to get him to come back. Muybridge talks to Pepper here at the university, who, as far as I can tell, is the one who really pays all the bills. Edwards ships everything. Thank goodness he gets rid of all of it, sends it to Pepper, who then sends it out in the world. And he sells some, he gives most of it away. And throughout the 20th century, people close their collections, they go out of business, and they all send it back to Philadelphia, thank goodness, which is why there are these absolutely fabulous collections here. And I think I'll stop at that point. That's more than you can probably take. And maybe we can take a look at some of the actual objects that are out here on the table.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe take a round of questions, just
Okay.
to ask people, let this,
Or opinions. You can
or
tell
opinions,
me,
and then we'll
you can
type
tell me
back.
that I'm wrong on all of this too.
Just to be clear, one quick question.
Yeah.
Edward sent matrices to William Pepper was the provost, if that wasn't clear.
Mhm.
He sent the actual printing matrices to Pepper, the whole operation?
Supposedly, he sent the negatives, the positives, and about 2,000 plates. It was a lot that came back, and
Jim, who knows?
and there you go.
Sitting around the university somewhere.
The plates supposedly were sold for $1 a piece. The actual ink on paper.
Okay, final, yeah, the word plate gets confusing in
Yep.
the story because it's the final thing, but it's also the.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, lots of questions. Liliana Weisberg, first question.
Thank you so much. This is very, very exciting. I wonder about the idea of stability. You have started out to explain that there is a process invented that stabilizes the image on paper.
Mhm.
So the great advantage is the hardening gelatin, the matrix. Now we can have the book. But interestingly enough, it provokes the instability of the book, because suddenly the book is not something printed in an edition to be circulated, but it's a pick and choose and an individual combination that is put together of the images. So I wonder whether you can think further about stability of print versus the stability of the photograph. If that's
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point in terms of Muybridge. We do have some of the 11 volumes as he originally conceived it. So we're not without the original. It's just that we have all these extras now. You're absolutely right. It makes for unique objects as opposed to editioned, what we think of as a published book, which is many copies of the same thing.
May I just follow up?
Please.
You said we have the original copies, but I wonder whether we have not to question what original means here.
In terms of anything printed, there are always going to be anomalies. I was watching last week as we were looking at all the different types of, little things that come up when you edition something. when you're doing images, it's even more important than type. And there are people that say, when you edition a photograph, they're all in some way unique. Every Dürer is a unique Dürer. Every Rembrandt is a unique Rembrandt because of the way it's wiped, because of the chemistry. But as much as it can be, those 11 volumes, and this is again one of the things that Edwards figured out, is that he was able to, at least as much as you can, make the same image over and over, not just hundreds, but thousands of times. Yeah.
Well, that kind of connects to what I was wondering, because you made the point that Edwards' technique is a relief process. I take it that gelatin is very, these gradations must be very small. We're not looking at something that you could see by the eye is like a real.
You actually can see them in the same way that if you take a carbon print and you hold it at an angle, you can see the relief.
But
I didn't
not
mean to
like a
cut you
woodcut,
off.
not
No,
like a woodcut.
no.
So I guess my question is like, but these books, what we have on the table, they're all printed, so that the image is on a separate leaf, printed separately. But if it's a relief process, like was there any attempt to print this with letterpress on the same?
Absolutely. Another of Edwards' specialties was that he would print the gelatin matrix in several inks. A very thick ink, which would get the black high tones, and a very thin ink that would sort of slip down into the crevices. So the same sheet of paper would be printed 2, 3, 4 times. And then if there was letterpress, they could do the letterpress onto the same sheet. Because water is involved and there is a lithographic element to this, the gelatin does attract water in those deep crevices and rejects water in the mountains. In the same way as lithography, it is in a way the best of both worlds. But as Edwards printed them, it is a relief process. And absolutely, you could either print the text first or second, because the images involve water. My guess is that the text would come last. But it was meant to be part of books. It was meant to be part of magazines and journals and newspapers. It was meant, the other good part of this process, as opposed to the later collotypes, is the fact that when you're printing vertically, there isn't that stretching. Whereas you're printing horizontally, under a lot of pressure, the paper gets stretched out. And because Edwards is printing several times on the same sheet, he doesn't want that pressure. He doesn't want the paper pulled. He wants to just touch from the top. And in that way, he's able to do several onto the same sheet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That was his attempt anyway.
Yeah, Linda and Jerry.
Yeah, I had a question about the paper. I mean, that was one thing, what is the paper? If you're printing letterpress and you're printing, because you need to have a special kind of paper often for these processes. And we can tell that, when you look at these, that this is a special paper that they're using there. Can you speak a little bit to the paper?
Sure, it's a great question. He could print a heliotype on anything. For these projects, which were very high-end projects, they had a special linen paper made specifically for Muybridge, or someone did. Lippincott probably had the paper made specifically, not only the linen aspect of it, but to size. So it's not like they were taking big rolls. They had the paper exactly as they wanted it. That said, he had it down, and he could print not only on paper but on fabric and other materials. In the same way that a wood block, the Japanese would print on fabric and all kinds of substances, substrates. Edwards could, whether other people using what they called the heliotype process could. And I should just mention, there's a gorgeous book on the table that I am seeing for the first time today, which was printed in London after Edwards left, using what they call the heliotype process. Absolutely beautiful images. So clearly they're using the process the right way, but not everyone did. Helio, sun god, and type, it was a common name. There's actually, if you look up the history, there's someone actually making something they call the heliotype back in the 1850s, which has nothing to do with, and I always think it's interesting that Muybridge originally starts photographing using the name Helios. That was his nickname when he first started a career as a photographer.
Other questions? Jerry.
This was wonderful. I have nuts and bolts questions. I'm asking if you can explain a bit more about the processes. One was you mentioned that Edwards, first when he's doing the portraits, is printing them in books, but that the images are fading to either all black or all white. So if you could talk a bit more about what that process was. And then the other question I have is if you can explain again in a simple way how the gelatin print as a relief gets the gray tones. And so how is it not a technology that gives you just blacks and whites, which obviously it's not.
Yeah. The portraits first. He's printing albumin silver prints. Each month they come out with these little tiny actual photographs tipped in, pasted in to other pages of text with little biographies. And then those are bound together at the end of the year. So it is actual cut and pasted photographs, and they did fade. There are wonderful sets that no one has ever looked at, which are in great condition because, no light has gotten into them. There are others. A lot of the men and women who were photographed loved their portrait. And so there are a lot of these that are cut apart and used. Just somebody would buy it to just have their own portrait and throw away the rest. But so that's the images.
And are these, I mean, if they're all individually printed and individually tipped in, are these very expensive publications? I mean, how are they priced?
Yeah. You would get a subscription, and then you could buy it in the end. This is high end, yes. This is not your little magazine. On the other hand, there was a real market for it. Photographic portraits were the big thing at the time. And everybody wanted a picture of the Queen. Everybody wanted a picture of Darwin and Dickens and so on. So they were able to, there were subscribers, there were people to buy these. And so they did charge. I don't remember the cost, although it's written down, we can find it fairly easily. So the second, the ink is held into the gelatin by reticulation. It is also held by the fact that the gelatin itself attracts and doesn't attract water and ink in the same way as lithography. And then you've got all of these different layers of inks, so that when you press down, the paper goes down to this very light ink, and then it picks up the sort of middle tones that are halfway, and then it picks up the really black tones at the top in one pass. I don't mean to say these are many passes. There are many inks for that one image, and it just miraculously, he is able to get these absolute full tone images in ink. He also later on starts printing with different colored inks and also with multiple negatives, so that Edwards is much later one of the first photographers to come up with what he calls printed color photography. But it sounds impossible.
But clearly not.
but
Yeah.
he was able, and when you look at the Muybridge images, you do see the full tone image.
But they are always perfectly flat. They don't have the raised and lower
No,
places that. an action would have.
exactly. You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. It is a flat ink image, yes. As much as ink is flat, but we
Thank
don't have to bring in a microscope. We can look at them, yeah. It does seem impossible, but there you are. And the matrices, he said, were the size of very thick stationery, which gives you a little bit of something to go on. If you have a sort of mat that you put down on the table, that's what we're talking about in terms of the actual matrices.
Adam, question from Zoom. Go ahead, Adam.
Hey, do you guys hear me?
Yeah, sure can.
All right, great. Sorry, I wish I could be there. Sounds amazing.
Adam's one of our digital photographers. Hey.
I actually worked on digitizing some of those plates, but my questions
Thank you.
are, well, my pleasure. I'm sorry, I missed the first part. So I guess I was just curious as to what the distinction between the heliotype and collotype processes are, aside from collotype being a more lithographic or requiring more of a lithographic press and not using alum as a hardener. Are there other discrepancies between those processes?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the 19th century, because this was such a big issue, there are people in every city where there's photography working out different ways of doing this. And most photo historians, this is dangerous territory, most photo historians simply say, we don't care. We'll call them collotype. Anything done from gelatin, anything where a printing press was involved, we'll just call it all collotype. And for many years, for most of the 20th century, that's all we really distinguished this type of work, and museums would have nothing to do with it. And they said they were mostly postcards anyway, so who cares? The fact is that there actually were a lot of different types of collotype, especially in the 1860s, 1870s. Braun comes up with this wonderful process for making both carbon prints and his own version of gelatin prints. And so when you ask what the difference is, it's one of many. And I don't mean to sort of try and avoid your very good question, What Edwards was able to do was make it commercially viable. And not a lot of the other recipes, not a lot of the other people, even Swan, who comes up with this carbon process originally, is able to do it on a big scale. And so more than chemistry, more than water, ink, it is the fact that he could make many, that makes him important, and someone to get back into the history books.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, Whitney and then Jim.
I just have a question about motivation. So thank you for your talk. This was really fascinating. But to what extent, like in your opinion, having looked at all these materials, like what's most motivating to people trying to solve this problem? Like, is it that they want to print photographs at scale? Is it that they want to print photographs of books? Like I've seen some of the work on how a desire to produce like facsimiles of medieval manuscripts might have been at the root of this. Is it a desire to like create a new reproduction process that could be used to print books? Or is it just like the photograph as an object of curiosity and a desire to see it done at scale?
Yeah, great question. It starts literally as soon as Talbot, copyrights his first image. He's trying to figure out how to print it in ink so that it will last. And so it's bigger than just the book world. It really is the fragileness, the looking for the lasting image for all aspects of everything which is made chemically. It's to somehow move it from chemistry to ink, because you've got your Gutenberg, you've got your early whatever, and they've lasted because they're this permanent ink. And chemistry would just keep moving. It was not an end in itself. And so I think the answer is all of the above. Whether it was images that were meant as just a one-off, or something meant to be additioned. I think everybody was aware of just how quickly this either faded or developed at that time.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for this talk. It's more than I had expected, and I'm very pleased. Yeah, and then actually one of the things I'm very pleased about is the whole explanation about the color types, because I'd always wondered about that. And it does make me think about we need to change enhance our catalog by records by including the term heliotype as for all our catalog references to the Animal Locomotion publication. I was curious, do you have any idea how many actual individual plates were published? Because I got the impression that it was, aside from the idealized edition that included everything, that what basically survived is people buying individual plates and then binding them, as you say. And I know we have a diary reference, which I think I may have shown you in our collection, of a banker in Philadelphia buying some individual plates of Muybridge, coming around and getting him to sign up for some plates. So did Edwards print like 500 editions of every single plate, or did he print like just 20 copies of each plate to begin with, and then would do everything else basically on demand? Did you know, based on how things turned out in the end with all these stacks of extra plates, which a lot of them ended up back at the University Archives? I'm just kind of curious what you know about Edwards' process. Did he print a huge number at the beginning, or did he print like small sets of them as time went on?
Yeah, there you've hit upon it. That's the question.
Yeah.
And I have no written record about that. Clearly, he did print more than one to begin with, but I don't think it was more than a handful to begin with, and then had to keep printing over and over. He does talk about, or there are articles about him speaking and showing the printing while he's lecturing. And so maybe there were some that came. Maybe he printed up in as late as 1895. We just don't know. And this is part of the trouble, is that we say the project was over in 85, 86, 87. People use different dates. But it wasn't over. And orders did continue to come in. And there were these matrices in the shop. And I don't know how many there are of any given plate. They are numbered 781. I don't believe there are other plates out there beyond 781 within the commercial world. I mean, there are plates where he's trying to figure things out and proofs, but I don't think he went on and printed more after that. He goes on to all kinds of other projects, and by the time we get to the end of this project, he's also fed up and wants to move on. And, you know, he does the zooprax cinescope and all of that. And then I'm so sorry. And then
We have
he,
some plates that are not numbered. I think
Yeah,
ours.
we have some as
that are
well.
plates
Don't-
that do-
They
that
don't
do
have the printed number. on
Do not have
Yeah,
a
it's like-
printed number, whatever
They're
that.
not the finished printed, I mean, it's the image, but they didn't finish the other step of printing the
Yeah.
plate number on it.
that's terrific. Wow.
I don't know what
that's
that means
great.
exactly, but.
Yeah.
And, you know, it could very well be that Edwards is holding some aside and doesn't want to go to the trouble of finishing them. Maybe he doesn't like the way they printed out, and so they don't get used.
But I guess there's also issues with storing the matrices. I guess just like, you know, storing when they would do typesetting for
It's
certain
not
books. that they would
stereotype
reprint,
plates
they
in
would
the
always
basement
keep-
problem, yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a question online and a question in the back.
I believe that Vaishami Sengupta would like.
Sure.
Hi, thank you. Hi, thank you so much. I'm curious to hear if John Murray was sort of continued their collaboration with Ernest Edwards, and if they sort of had more, you know, worked more with him in the future. And particularly, I'm also curious to hear you talk a little bit about how audiences perceived these images as opposed to other kinds of images in photographic, in scientific books. Did they consider this sort of more accurate? Did it have, in your opinion, do you think it had any impact on audience perception of other kinds of images? I'm thinking particularly of travelogues where they use sketches by travelers transformed into engravings. Was there sort of a change, perception that was a little bit too lo-fi, as it were?
Yeah. Really good question. The John Murray part of it is a quick answer. He only does the Darwin with John Murray because then he is contractually obligated to only print with Osgood and leaves as soon as this book is at the binder and gets on the ship. And so after that, the next 12 years are under Osgood's firm, and that changes hands several times, but there aren't any that I know of. I'd love to hear if there are others, but there aren't any other books or projects that I know of with the whole Murray company. And remind me, the second part?
Sort of
Um,
status,
This-
cultural
yeah,
value
yeah.
or significance.
At the time, and I think this is probably hard for us to realize, heliotype was a really big deal. that year that he copyrights it and starts letting people know about it, the annual fair at the V&A is all about Edwards, and people come. He opens up his shop one day a week and lets people come and watches them on press, and they can take a heliotype home with them. So it's not just a few people, it really is the general public at the beginning who learn about this. By the time he gets to New York City, he advertises 6 separate processes that he's an expert in. And by that time, that's 84, he already isn't using the word heliotype. Even though Muybridge publishes it, he calls them gelatin prints, and has a variety of ways that he's doing gelatin prints. And by that time, photogravure becomes the really big deal in New York City. So it has a window, if that makes sense, where it's really big. And then both Edwards and the public, as happens, sort of move on to other things. Halftone was cheaper. Halftone was, even though heliotype was relatively fast and cheap, as soon as you start doing these things with multiple images and folded plates, and then it gets complicated, and a halftone would be much faster. And let's face it, most people don't really care. They just want an image. They're not looking for the greatest image on earth. They're just looking for a postcard they can send mom.
Yeah, I do think there's a kind of wonderful history of technology that you're giving us here, and it's really complex one about openings and closings, great successes and failures, a lot of competition. Sounds like if people try to rip people off, and then
Yep.
and what you just said here, this kind of that something spectacularly great actually might be relatively short-lived.
Yeah,
It's like red printing in the 15th century, you know, they could do it, and then it just such a pain in the.
But it's interesting how it feels, it's very similar to, say, mid-20th century photocopy technology, like where you're trying to find something that lasts.
You know, the wet.
And the
yeah,
Xerox
yeah.
technology wins because it lasts,
Mhm.
and you can print it on normal paper,
Right.
you know, which is similar. It's like more like printing, though it doesn't have any. So there's a kind of repetition of that problem where you have all the technology to do it, but it doesn't last. It's too chemical.
Yeah.
Yep.
But can I ask you, because I'm still confused about the, so that's the glass, that's like an example of the glass.
those are his glass
net-
positives.
These are so those are the like photographic positive.
Yep. That are
And then we
shipped.
have the printed on paper
Yep.
positives, but we don't have the gelatin.
Gelatin rate.
So none of that survived.
I haven't found it.
Okay.
Some of your negatives
Some of these negatives,
are
yeah.
very black. And I'm wondering if there weren't tests on the negative. But the heliotype matrix, I have yet to find anybody who says they have them.
So those that look like photograph negatives, those, yeah, what is that? I'm totally confused about that.
I don't know.
So-
We call them gelatin negatives, but I don't know.
Call them gelatin negatives.
So
And they
Consumers can't see
And they
exactly.
are,
We
like
can lift it
most
up.
photography, I mean, albumin is silver particles floated in gelatin. This was what everyone was using at this time.
but then that's being printed on glass
That's,
first.
that's the negative from which you get the gelatin contact printed matrix, which is then inked. And from that, you get the ink on paper.
So you
How
have
does
to make
that
a
fit in?
negative from that, make a negative
From
from
the glass.
That's
glass
Photographic.
ones, Yeah.
That's
yeah,
And then
correct.
I see.
Yeah.
And we call it an interpositive, and to get an internegative, to get an interpositive, to get the final positive.
Okay.
And each one also you have to remember which one is reversed because you've got get the horses running in the right direction. So there's that also.
Yeah, Zoom comment.
Yeah, this is a follow-up from Adam. He wanted me to ask, do we know if Edwards explored Woodbury type at all?
That's such a great question.
Woodbury type,
Yeah.
which is what?
So you make a carbon print, right? And heliotype went off this way and Woodbury type went off this way. There was this guy named Woodbury. So of course he names it after himself. And he uses the hard gelatin as a mold. And he uses these hydraulic presses, makes a mold out of the gelatin, and then fills the mold with material and hydraulically pushes. He's got this lead mold. Lead is sort of soft, so he can make the mold. And then he pushes this material into that. It squirts out the edges, so it has to be trimmed. It's really thick, so it ends up cracking and breaking, and then it has to be glued on. And so it lifts up a little bit. And there's this wonderful Civil War series of all the medical treatments during the Civil War. And they were mainly done with Woodbury types. And when they got to the second edition, the Woodbury types were in such bad shape that they contracted with Edwards to replace them with heliotypes. The other thing about Woodbury types are that they can't be big because you've got this enormous hydraulic press. Most of them are about this size. And so they're beautiful, they're thick, they're usually purple, or that's the color of the material. And that also had a relatively short shelf life, although there is a wonderful man in California making Woodbury types.
Right now.
Right now.
Okay.
I believe he's still at it.
He's still at it. Yeah.
Thank you, please.
Thank you so much for this talk. I learned so much. Fascinating. I've done a little work on lithography. That's where I'm coming from. And I was really interested in the debate that you mentioned where there was a debate that colotypes, whether the colotype was a planographic form of printing or relief printing. Very interesting because I've never really thought that there were places, printing technologies that were in the interstices like that. So I loved that. My question builds on Oshani's comment, where I loved that she asked about how audience perceived the text. My question is sort of related because I'm interested in how people would look at the menu of printing options available and decide which ones to pick. And what I've gotten so far from this is it would be a combination of factors. So it might be which printers are local to you, how expensive, how much money you had, what your fee structure was like, maybe the granularity of the image. And it's so fascinating to hear that it's also about the fashion or maybe the buzz around a technology. But I'd love to hear you talk about if there's anything else I've missed. What would people be thinking of when they have this array of options that are efflorescing in the 19th century? And I wonder if it also had something to do with maybe a cosmopolitan around this technology, since it seemed to be based in New York and London. That's my first comment/question. And then my second question is, what happens to the gelatin negatives once they're no longer useful? Were they recyclable, or was it that they were just destroyed and dissolved? And I ask this because I thought that from your lecture, I feel like I've learned that the gelatin negatives were useful precisely because they were stable. So I was really interested that not many exist. So I wondered about the end of the life cycle of those prints.
Really, two really good questions. Most printing firms had their specialty, and you went to a certain person for your photogravure, you went to somebody else for halftone. Few that I know of were like Edwards. And if you look just in newspapers or magazines with his advertisements, he actually lists these 6 processes, and he says, and it's not the Osgood version of this, it's the other version that we're doing here, as though they would know to choose that. And yet they did. And yet it was meaningful at the time. Remember that this isn't something somebody is buying to put in their house. This is publishers for the most part. This is book people, museum people, the actual photographers themselves who want their prints done. And they're reading the Philadelphia Photographer Journal. They're reading, everybody is keenly aware of this.
So like a trade knowledge that people in the business.
Yeah, and if nothing else, because of all the lawsuits. I mean, everybody was suing everybody else to say, you know, Edwards is just doing this, you know, it's already been done.
I
And
was wondering about that. I think there's a whole different seminar on
there
that
you
one.
go.
Yeah.
And so, and yet they did. I don't know how, but it was meaningful to the people who were ordering the process and coming to Edwards in particular for a particular outcome. Edwards himself, I'll just take this one step further, is that Edwards himself just falls in love with photogravure, even before he gets as far as Muybridge. And he does this because it's his bread and butter, because this is what he's known for now. He's the guy that you go to for these ink prints. When what he really wants to be making are these gorgeous hand-wiped copperplate photogravure, and he publishes his own, this is more than you want to know. He publishes his own high-end magazine called Sun and Shade, which is all photogravure and heliotype. And it's absolutely gorgeous in big plates, not quite as big as this, but elephant size magazine with the most beautiful images, and makes his own market for these things. In the end, in the late 1890s, he's doing Alfred Stieglitz printing. A few times. I'm really going out on a limb here now, and it makes me a little nervous. But you don't want to change all of your records. I'm the one saying this, and so you will hear from other people. It's just Holotype, and don't be bothered. The idea of this, the best of lithography connected with the best of relief, which is what I think we're seeing here. It's not that I want to throw out all of lithography in terms of process, but it really is different. It really is different from what other people are doing.
And it speaks to something that's come up in the seminar before, in different contexts, of at least a certain group of people really knew, whatever century, you know, knew and understood the differences in a way that I'm not sure modernity has given us. So we're going to take a last comment for Jerry, and then we're going to look. Julie's going to show us some stuff.
Exposing my ignorance of the history of photography and ignorance of terms that one sees all of the time. The mention of Stieglitz brings forward something, you know, I've been puzzling through all along, which is we've been talking about the gelatin prints and Edwards process as an industrial process relating to publication on a large scale, modest scale, but large scale. We go to art museums and we see, you know, brilliant individual photographs by the famous photographers, and they are silver gelatin prints often. I'm wondering then, are the photographers making those negatives? Do they have mastery of the gelatin process? What is the relationship between Edwards' process and business and the individual fine art photographers' control of the technology, use of the technology, presumably. And I guess a use that is still carried on by some people who are abjuring the digital. So can you place this in the context of the individual fine art photographer?
Yeah, and a really good question. A good way of thinking about it, or one option, is to think about fine art printers today who make the image, who maybe draw on the stone, but they're not actually the ones who print up the edition, or who carve the woodblock and then someone else does the printing, particularly in the East, where you've got somebody who draws an image, someone else who puts it on the plate. Edwards dealt with a lot of artists in order to help them get the image they wanted. And it was not only for books, but for one-off as well. Especially toward the end of his lifetime, he also was an artist. He made his own one-off, whether it was a heliotype or a photogravure. He entered the same contests that everybody else was entering. And so he did do it on that sort of museum scale. It's unfortunate, I think, that the word collotype over the 20th century has somehow gotten a bad name. And because of that, there are fewer of those images in collections. On the other hand, there's a wonderful man named Richard Benson, who is an expert, not only printer himself, but print historian. And he liked to say that there are relatively few photographs, chemical photographs in the world, and hundreds of millions of photographs in ink in the world. And it's true. Not all of them are museum quality. But once they figured out a way to do that, it is the chemical photograph that really dropped out and became the anomaly, the one that, oh, we'll make one special one for the memorial or something. And during the 20th century, you thought you were very brave if you went into the darkroom and you made your own something. Now it's hard to even find a university that teaches darkroom because you're using your.
And it was Benson's name that I could not remember when I was thinking about Peter Barberi's talk.
There you go.
He was speaking, among other things, about Benson's relationship with Meriden gravure.
And Benson is one of the few people. He did this wonderful 16-hour lecture at the Museum of Modern Art during his show, which is on YouTube. It's broken up by process, so you don't have to watch straight through for 16 hours. But he talks about making collotypes at Meriden gravure, and he explains it in the way they were doing it in the 1960s, which is completely different from what Edwards, for instance, was doing in the 19th century. And it's, he's not making it up. It is what they did, but it's also different. It's a different process. But to listen to those, that's actually, there, Peter, I was going to play a little bit of Benson's lecture and just didn't get it together because he does talk about carbon print at length in particular as the greatest of all the processes.
I think we should thank Julie one more time.